right, we're going to go ahead and get started again. If you have any problems, if you can't hear me or anything, please let Luke know. He'll let me know. You can type that into the chat. If you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box, and we'll answer those at the end. Luke's also going to be dropping some links occasionally as I mention them, so that you guys have that as well. We'll also send out an email after the presentation is done, probably in the next couple days, that also include all of those links as well. So I'm Audrey Menninga. I am the director for the Invasive Species Network. We are a SISMA, a cooperative invasive species management area. We're a nonprofit located in Northwest Michigan, the lower peninsula of Northwest Michigan. And we kind of pride ourselves on being a hub of terrestrial invasive species knowledge. So today we're going to go over a couple of webinars or a couple of species. We had a little poll with some of our e-news readers about what they most wanted to hear about. So today we're going to be covering invasive knotweeds, invasive buckthorns, invasive honeysuckles, and tree of heaven. And we're going to be talking about how to identify them, what you can do for treatment, and some species that you can replace them with. We're going to talk a little bit more about ISN before we get started. So these are some of our major partners. We're very partner focused. You can see in the corner here, this is Manistee, Leelanau, Manistee, Benzie, Leelanau, and Grand Traverse counties. Those are the 4 counties that we cover in the Northwest Michigan area. We're primarily grant funded, about 95% grant funded. And we work with everyone from the federal government with the Forest Service and Sleeping Bear Dunes all the way down to private landowners. In Michigan, people who are working on invasive species are SISMAs. Michigan is very unique in that it has a SISMA for every county in the state of Michigan. So most people are covering multiple counties. You can see a full list here. So if you're not in our service area, but you do live in Michigan, one of these SISMAs, you can find them. There's other agencies, federal agencies and state agencies are also doing a lot of invasive species and restoration work. We've got other nonprofits, land conservancies, stewardship networks. All of those groups are all working on invasive species, and individual landowners, which is probably what you guys are here for. So we have 10 active partners, and they sit on our board. We also have over 60 supporting partners. These are some of our programs that we run. Our Go Beyond Beauty program is a voluntary program that works with, we work with nurseries, landscapers, garden professionals, and community members to not use or sell high priority ornamental invasive species. And I've got another slide about Go Beyond Beauty as well. We actively do control, so we work with partners and landowners to manage invasive knotweeds, invasive bittersweet, garlic mustard, and invasive Phragmites on private and public properties. We also work with early detection species. So those are species that are very small in populations. For instance, we have a species called black swallowwort, and it's only found in 1 village in our 4 counties. So we try to prioritize those, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. We also run volunteer work bees. So we do garlic mustard work bee in each of our 4 counties. We're doing baby's breath work bees on the sand dunes in the summertime. And we also do outreach. So we are working with pretty much anybody that wants to listen to us talk about invasive species. We will give a presentation to those organizations. So our Go Beyond Beauty program, we really like to highlight this because it's a really important program. We noticed that there's a lot of starting to be a lot more demand for native species. And so we really wanted to work with that and bringing that knowledge to landowners as well. And so this program originally started working with garden professionals like nurseries and landscapers to not use or sell high priority invasive species. And then we had landowners and businesses that also wanted to participate and show that their landscapes were a Go Beyond Beauty landscape. So we involved them as well. And then we had people across the state who were interested in Go Beyond Beauty as well. So we've actually started to move this program statewide, and we have several hubs open right now across the state of Michigan. So we only limit, for our area at least, there's 33 species that are participating nurseries and landscapers do not use or sell. For our hubs, it's about 13 species instead.
Hey, Audrey.
So it's yeah, go ahead, Luke.
It sounds like your screen isn't being shared right now.
Oh, is it not?
Or at least on my end, it's just showing the open slide.
Huh. Let me see what's going on.
That seems to have worked.
All right, perfect.
Maybe try advancing a slide or going back and, yep, looks like
Okay.
it's working.
Great, wonderful.
Awesome.
Apparently you can't just tell it to share PowerPoint, it needs to share everything. I apologize. You didn't miss much for screens. I'll show you. So we have, these are our major partners that we work with. Most of them sit on our board. And then this was just a quick snapshot of all of the SISMAs in Michigan. If you live in Michigan, you're covered by one of these SISMAs. A lot of times outside of Michigan, they're called CWMAs, so cooperative weed management areas. So always, if you live outside of Michigan, check to see if you have one of those. On the East Coast, they're called PRISMs, Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management. It's a longer one, and sometimes I get it confused. This was the slide we had just finished on that talked about some of our different programs. And this was the slide that it was on when we found out that I wasn't switching screens on a presentation mode. Technology is great and wonderful, and I love it very much. But anyway, Go Beyond Beauty is a great program that we're really excited about. You can see on the side, those are some of our participating nurseries and garden centers, and some of our landscapers that also participate. If you live in Michigan and outside of our service area, keep an eye out to see if a hub opens up near you. You can go on Go Beyond Beauty's website to see those other hubs. But back to ISN, really the reason that we are doing this is because habitat matters. For people, for their recreation and enjoyment. For our area, we are a big ecotourism area, so a lot of people are coming up here to see the wonderful views and the beautiful sights. They're usually not coming up to see a field of garlic mustard. They really want to see this field of trillium that you can see down here. And it's really important for wildlife. All of our native wildlife needs native plants to live and repopulate. And so we need to be really focused on making sure we're keeping habitats available for them. This is one of my favorite slides because I really enjoy showing off oak trees. Oak trees are kind of called the tree of life. So these are native species ranked by their ability to support butterfly and moth species. You can see that oak trees are up there at top with 534 different species. We get a lot of questions about people asking how long something sticks around before something starts to learn to eat it. And the answer is that it varies, and sometimes it doesn't vary well. So you can see here, these are all introduced species. Invasive Phragmites, which we do work with a lot up here, in its home range can support 170 different herbivore species. Here it supports 5, and it's been here for over 300 years. And so that's kind of why we continue to do this management. Eventually, something will learn to eat it, but the amount of time that it takes may not support that species that's going to learn to eat that species. And we really like to talk about what's invasive, because a lot of times invasive gets thrown around a lot. People will often use invasive for something that's maybe a native but an aggressive grower. So the definition for invasive is something that's non-native. It's being brought here. It's going to have few natural predators because the predator didn't come with it, just the species did. So when you hear people talking about biocontrols, what that is that means somebody found a predator from its home region and brought it here. So you can see this is the purple loosestrife beetle here. We released that to help manage large purple loosestrife populations. It's going to have massive seed production. You can see this is an invasive honeysuckle, which we'll be talking about a little later. These are all berries. They come along the entire stem. When you have a native honeysuckle, you'll find those berries just at the ends of the branches. So massive seed production is usually a pretty big sign that it's an invasive. Some things that aren't invasive include corn, poison ivy, though I understand why people would like to manage it. It's not the nicest plant for other people. Riverbank grape, we get a lot of calls about riverbank grape because it does grow up trees. It can grow very aggressively. Vines are known to be aggressive growers in general, but it is native. The grapes do support bird populations. Horsetail and scouring rush is another one. We've had people who say that it's unsightly on their beaches or it's taking over beaches. It is a native species. It does support a lot of animals. Also, it's very difficult to control. It's a prehistoric species, so I'm personally partial to it, but I understand that some people get annoyed by it. When we're talking about invasive species, we talk about the invasive species curve, and this is what helps us decide different projects to take on. So you've got your base down here at introduction. That's when people first start planting it, when it first makes its way here. Oftentimes you aren't going to see it. If you do see it, that's great. You can manage it then, very easy. That's when you've got purple loosestrife. That's just this one plant here. Then we start getting up to detection, which is oftentimes where we start to notice it, and we may be starting to think about managing it. You're starting to see it more often, starting to wonder if it might be a problem, thinking about trying to control it. Detection is when you really want to hit it, because that is still a manageable population. Then we get up to widespread awareness. That's where you've got it in multiple locations. Management is probably not an option at that point. This purple loosestrife plant turns into these purple loosestrife plants, and every organization that's working with invasive species is limited by their time, by their funding, by the personnel they have. So we have to be very strategic about when we're picking and choosing what we're going to work with. How did they get here? A lot of times they get imported accidentally. Invasive Phragmites likely came in on ballast water. Everyone's very familiar, I think, at this point with zebra mussels, especially if you live in Michigan. Those came in on ballast water. They're things that accidentally get taken here. Imported for gardens is actually one of our biggest ones. That is how we have about 50% of our invasive species. Ornamental invasives are very popular. Japanese barberry is probably the #1 popular one that I can think of off the top of my head. We'll talk about the ornamentals a little bit more on the next slide. They're planted to manage soil erosion. I think most people are also familiar with autumn olive at this point. It was planted for soil erosion. Then the NRCS started noticing that the birds really like the berries, and so they started encouraging conservation districts to sell it for wildlife habitat. And then we started noticing that it was out of control. Kudzu has a similar story. It was planted for soil erosion. Some people plant it ornamentally because they like the flowers on it, but then it did get wildly out of control. And imported for food or medicine, a lot of our older ornamentals were brought like this. Some of our older invasive species were brought over for this, and that is because when people were immigrating here, they didn't know what plants they could eat, what plants they could use to treat different symptoms, so they would bring stuff with them. So we try to be very little sensitive about these ones, just because a lot of times there are connections to them. Not all non-natives are invasive, so all invasives are non-natives, but not all non-natives are invasive. So for every 100 non-native species introduced, 10 of them will naturalize, and 1 of them will become invasive. So you can see here, these are some of our ornamentals. And then this here is Dame's rocket. That is an invasive species. It was planted ornamentally. People loved it because it looks like phlox, but it isn't phlox. It's actually in the garlic mustard family. So trying to tell which plants are safe. If you see new non-native plants at the nursery, we usually, tell people to avoid those. There's a lot of organizations that will put up invasive species lists that you can check things against. We have one. MIPIN, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, also has one listed. You can always check it against that. We always recommend that people use scientific names, because common names are wildly different, especially across regions. So always check those scientific names. But like we said, not every non-native is going to become invasive. I usually use hydrangeas, which you can see here as a example, because I have them at my house. And if you don't water them for 24 hours in the summertime, they will literally die. So they're not one that I'm going to be worried about. But oftentimes we have a problem where we pick a lot of our ornamentals for the reasons that make them invasive. They can be sold across multiple regions. They require little work. They're not going to be eaten by deer. And that can really help them become invasive. We get a lot of people who say, well, I don't see that invasive species spreading in my yard. And that's usually because a lot of times it's got a berry, a bird is eating it, it goes into somebody else's property in the back, and it poops out that berry. That berry is still viable. And so now you can see here this little chain. We've got our barberry plant. A bird ate the barberry. This is a baby barberry. And now no one's noticed it or managed it. And now it's a field of Japanese barberry. So again, really tying in with the fact that it doesn't have any natural predators, other animals don't want to eat it, and it has prolific seed production. So that is really a big part of ornamental invasive species. We have on our website, these are high priority ornamental invasive species. So for us, that is all of the species that our Go Beyond Beauty participants cannot use or sell. And all of those red arrows are actually our top 12 species. So you can see how a lot of these ornamental invasive species have had cascading effects, so that now we're dealing with them, which is what our top 12 is. So you can see circled, those are the ones that are on the list of our Go Beyond Beauty nurseries. And they are still sold today. Calorie pear is starting to become less and less sold, depending on which state you're in. It may not be sold. Baby's breath is very common in especially pollinator seed mixes. For barberries, the Grand Rapids area is one of the biggest producers of Japanese barberry. So we're going to be covering today 4 of these species. So we're going to be covering the buckthorns, we're going to be covering knotweeds, tree of heaven, and honeysuckles, which are right here. There we go. So we'll go ahead and get started with knotweed, which is, I think, what most people were interested in. Knotweed is native to Asia. It has a kind of cool biology. The reason that it's so good at growing is because it has actually evolved so that when a volcano explodes, you've got lava coming down the mountain, and it will burn off the entire top part of the knotweed plant. And then once everything cools and hardens, it will actually go right back up through that lava. That's why it grows through anything. It's what it needs to do in its native range. It was introduced as an ornamental invasive, or wasn't invasive when it was introduced, but it was introduced as an ornamental. You can see down here, it has very beautiful white flowers. In the late summer, you can see pollinators just going around all of these flowers. It happens with a lot of with a lot of invasive species, where people say, well, there's all of these pollinators added, it's so good for the pollinators. A lot of times pollinators feeding off of an invasive species is a lot like us going to McDonald's. It's food and you're getting something from it, but you're not getting what you need. It is illegal in Michigan, so that does mean that it doesn't mean that if you have it, you have to get rid of it. It does mean that you can't sell it, you can't dig it up and move it somewhere. But if it's on your property, you aren't required to manage it at all. Obviously, it grows very densely. You can see again in this picture, nothing is growing under there. That is a monoculture. It's very difficult to control. It can grow through pretty much anything. So manual treatment, doing tarping is really not an option. Digging it up, these root systems are incredibly deep. And it can also cause property damage. Like you can see here, it's growing through brick. It can grow through cement. It grows through foundations. We had somebody who sent us a picture and it was growing in their garage and they weren't sure what to do with it. And I will say too, it's also very good at spreading itself. So it does grow like a bamboo. It's sometimes called in Michigan, it's called Michigan bamboo. You can see these little circles. These are all nodes, and they are all capable of creating a new plant. It's not to say that every time it happens that it gets cut there and you drop it on the ground, it's going to, but it can. And then it does have these hollow stems like a bamboo would as well. So there's a couple of different ways that you can treat it. You can do injections. So you're basically just pouring herbicide down these stems. You'll see a picture in a couple of slides with a needle that you can use. Or you can actually cut the stalk and you can dump herbicide straight down the middle of it. That's called a cut and fill. Then you have disposal concerns, and we can talk about that as well. A foliar spray is also an option. Mowing and cutting is not an option. It is more likely to spread it that way. So when we're talking about foliar treatment, I've started the ones that we use. So we use Milestone in June time. It isn't aquatic safe, but it does work with plants. I usually call it our showy killer because you can come back after a week and you're like, yes, that's dying. It bonds with a particular enzyme in plants. So we can't use it in aquatic areas. We also can't use it under a lot of different ornamental species, particularly like junipers are very sensitive to it. So when there's knotweed growing in a landscaped area, we oftentimes can't use milestone. So instead we'll come back with clearcast mix. So we mix clearcast, which is an imazamox, with some glyphosate. And that kind of also, that's our aquatic safe version that we'll use. You can do that, I think it's 90 days before the first frost. The other one that we'll use is a glyphosate mix at like about a 9%, which is a pretty strong mix for a foliar spray. We use Aquaneat, which makes it an aquatic safe spray. We often won't use this on our first spraying of knotweed. We'll usually use the clearcast with the lighter glyphosate, just because there are a lot of pollinators, so we're trying to be sensitive about it. And we can use that clearcast before the flowers come out. When we're using just glyphosate, we have to wait till the flowers come out. So we'll usually wait till the second year. The plants start getting stressed. They're not really putting out flowers. There's less risk to the pollinators. Imazapirs are another option. That has a little bit more, you have to be very strategic about where you're using it. It can cause some soil leaching, and then it can get to other plants and it can cause harmful effects on them. Because we're working in a lot of people's yards and landscapes, we tend not to use that, but it is a very thorough herbicide that you can use. So you can see up here, this is a site that we treated. And this is what it looked like after we treat it. It's not very sightly. Most people don't enjoy seeing it like that. This is another spot down here that we were doing some treatment in. And then you can see these are all of the dead stalks. They're all just woody, hollow stalks. We have a lot of people ask us about when you can cut those down. We usually say after the first frost is a safe time to cut them down. Some people like to burn them, and we always give warning that if you're going to burn them, they are just a hollow piece of wood and they will go very quickly. So just maybe don't do it all at one time. Make sure you're monitoring that fire. So the injections that you can do, you can see down here, this is our needle. And so basically it's poking out the other side. It's kind of hard to see. And then right in the middle of the needle is a small opening. And that is where you have the herbicide coming out and it's going down that stalk. And so that is usually what we do for small populations. It's time consuming. You're going to be using a high concentration with a low volume. So you're using 2 to 5 cubic centimeters per stem. And you do have to have a certain size plant for that. So you do need to have you have to have a big enough stalk that that needle can get that hole in the right spot. If it's too small, you can't get the opening into the plant, and then there's no point in it. It's also really good to use in sensitive areas. We oftentimes will work with landowners. Some organizations will rent needles out. And so we do this. Landowners can rent our needles. We walk them through how to use it. We make sure that they understand how to use herbicides, and then they can use it on their plants as well. When it comes to replacing knotweeds, if you're using milestones, some seeds will be susceptible to herbicide in the soil because sometimes milestone is used as a pre-emergent. So you want to wait a couple of years if you're going to be using milestone just to give it time. Or if you want to plant seedlings or saplings, something that's not a seed, that's a good idea as well. If you're going to plant while you're still doing treatment, make sure you're marking where those plantings are done so you don't accidentally spray them. If you want to be the safest you can possibly be, wait until the root system is decaying. The ground may start to feel squishy. For knotweeds, those roots can go about 10 feet deep, and then they can actually go outwards 15 to 30 feet. So they've got a very extensive root system below ground, and that's really what's helping them come back up or through lava, through cement, all of those fun things. But some species that you can use in placement for them, black cherries are great. I think they're beautiful trees. Aspens and poplars are pretty aggressive growers. They're clonal growth. So if you plant them somewhere, be aware that they are going to spread to their heart's content. Sugar maples are great. White oaks are great. If you're looking at shrubs, this is American hazelnut. You can get a bear or a nut that squirrels and birds might go for. Dogwoods are also really great. They're also pretty aggressive growers sometimes, depending on the species you're planting. Fragrant sumacs, shrubby cinquefoil. For perennials, purple coneflower is great. It's a also a pretty aggressive grower. It's found pretty much everywhere. And then perennial grasses, little, big blue stem are both great. So is switchgrass as well. It just depends on where your knotweed is, what you'd like to replace it with. You know, if you want a tree or a perennial or you want a grass to grow there. Going on to buckthorns. Buckthorns are native to Eurasia. They were introduced as an ornamental species. There are still some cultivars that are sold today. The problem with them is that they displace natives. You can see here, these are all just little buckthorn seedlings growing on the forest understory. They can be difficult to control because they have high germination rates, and they can actually impact amphibian reproduction. So they are actually putting out chemicals, and if they're growing in wetlands, they can impact the eggs that are laid by amphibians. Some of the control methods: mechanical, foliar spray, and cut stump. So we do have two types of invasive buckthorns. We've got common and glossy. So here are some of the differences between them, and then I'll do a visual one. Both of them are going to be small trees or shrubs, but glossy is going to start with multiple stems and then go into a single. So is common. Glossy is going to be a little bit easier to identify in the wetland areas because that's pretty much the only place they grow. And then common can grow pretty much anywhere. They're going to have different colored flowers. I know it doesn't sound like it when I say white, green, and green, yellow, but they are different colored flowers. And the big difference here is that glossy buckthorn, the male and female flowers are on the same shrub. Common buckthorn has separate shrubs for each. So you've got male shrubs and you've got female shrubs, and they cross-pollinate that way. The berries are also a big thing. For glossy buckthorn, you're going to have a progression of colors, and they're going to be multiple generations through July and September. On the common buckthorn, they're going to be green, and then they're going to be purple-black, and they're only going to appear on those female plants. So some of the ways to tell the difference, and it includes on here black cherry, which can be a similar species, especially when young. So you've got common buckthorn here, and if you scrape the bark away, you're going to see that it's pretty orangey under here, and so that's a good indication. It's a little bit less of an indication between glossy buckthorn and black cherry, but you're going to look for that bark. Black cherry has all of these little warts kind of on them, and it's more of a mahogany color than just this kind of dull brown. And then when you're looking at leaves, the glossy is going to have these deep, prominent veins down the middle. And there's actually, it's hard to tell in this photo, there are some small tooths around the edge. They're very, very small, but the glossy buckthorn is going to have smooth leaves. And then you're going to have opposite leaves. So you can see here, they're right across the stem from each other. And then we've got alternate leaves on the glossy buckthorn. Here's another picture. You can kind of see those little tooths a little bit better with the common buckthorn. And then you've got the glossy buckthorn, which, also true to its name, has a slightly glossier leaf. This is an alder, which can often grow in the same environments as well. It's going to be a bigger leaf in general, and it doesn't have those tooths. And then for the berries, you can see on the glossy buckthorn, you'll have multiple generations of berries on one plant. And then on our common buckthorns with the female plants, you're going to have all of those berries in one generation. So if you're looking at doing physical treatment, it's good for small populations and young plants. You can pull them up or you can dig them. This is a polar bear. It's a weed wrench. The brand name is Polar Bear, which we get because they're cute. And so there's different sizes of polar bears that equate to different sizes of shrubs. You can see over here, it's being used to pop something out of the ground. It clamps on to the bottom of the shrub down here, and then it's going to be using this leveraging power to pull it out of the ground so you can get some bigger shrubs than you would if you were just using your bare hands. You can also cut them low to the ground, but the shrubs are going to resprout. So there's these things called buckthorn baggies that you place over top of the buckthorn stump, and you're going to cinch it very tightly right at the base of the ground. You cannot let any light in. If you let any light in, it will put a little sucker out that way. So you have to make sure that it's staying pretty close to the ground, and then come back, in a year or two and pull the bags up so that we're not littering. And then if you're going to be doing this treatment, just keep in mind berry populations. So if you're going to be pulling something out of the ground and moving it around, you may want to try and contain that if it's got ripe berries on it, so you're not spreading those berries across your treatment site. For chemical treatment, you can do a cut stump treatment. This is what we usually recommend for most woody invasive species. It's got a lower risk for drift and off-target spray. You can see here, you're just treating this outside stump. That's the only part of the area that's living. So it's the only part that you need to put herbicide on. With buckthorn, if you're cutting it when it's younger and it's got multiple branches coming out, you do need to cut and dab all of those stalks so that you can get herbicide on everything. If you don't put herbicide on one of the stems that you've cut, it will probably start to grow back. There's a couple different triclopirs you can use. The two that we usually recommend are, there's a couple herbicides you can use. The two we recommend are triclopirs. That's what's considered a selective herbicide. So it's not going to kill grasses if you do spray it on the grass. And then glyphosate, it is a non-selective herbicide. It will kill grasses if it gets sprayed. It's less of a concern with cut stumps because, again, you are just doing this right on the stem there. You can do these treatments any time of year except for spring, because when you're doing these treatments, you're using a systemic herbicide, which means it's going down and its mode of action is through the root system. And if you're going to treat it in the springtime, everything that's in the roots is coming up into the leaves to bud out. So you're not going to get that same hit of herbicide that you would want it to. Again, if you're working with berries, you're cutting these plants, and if you're going to be moving them around, you may not want to do it when it's doing a berrying. And then if you're doing it in the wintertime, sometimes we usually mix with water. In the wintertime, it may be better to work with a forestry oil because it has a lower freezing point. So it's a little bit safer, especially if it's very cold. And so then you would need an ester formulation, which triclopyr does make. That's Garlon 4 is the most common name for that. For doing a foliar spray, it's fine for young plants. It's a little bit hard to do a foliar spray on mature shrubs because they tend to have smaller leaves, and you do have to get an even coating on the whole thing, or else if you miss an entire side of the shrub, that side will continue to live. So we usually only recommend it for anything that's usually about chest high or lower. It does have a little bit more of a risk for drift and off-target spray just because you are, above the plant. You're not doing a very controlled action. You can use the same chemicals. You can do it during any time in the growing season. Obviously, you need the leaves out because that's what you're spraying the herbicide onto. Again, keeping in mind when the berries are out and there may be birds moving through the trees and pollinators during the blooming season. When it comes to replacing buckthorns, we've got elderberry, which prefers partial sun and wet soils, so it may be a good replacement for glossy buckthorns. The berries are eaten by birds, and you can also eat them as well. A lot of people like elderberry tea or lemonade. We've got buffalo berry. If you're doing any work with autumn olive, this is actually in the autumn olive family, but it is native. And I do want to specify that these are all native to Northwest Michigan. If you're outside of that area, you should probably double check to make sure that they're native in that area. But buffalo berry is a shorter shrub, puts out a ton of berries. It does like sunny areas with sandy soils. And then we've got wild plum. It's a small tree or a large shrub. It's got showy white flowers that the pollinators love. It puts out fruits that the birds and mammals will forage. And it's really good for bank stabilization. It can do full sun to partial shade with well-drained soils. Tree of Heaven. So this one's been in the news a lot, especially if you're out on the East Coast, because it is the primary host for spotted lanternfly. It's native to China. It was introduced as an ornamental, especially when they discovered it could grow pretty much anywhere. As you can see down here, it's growing through this tiny crack between the pavement and a tree. It was often used in city landscapes. It's very good at displacing natives. You can see here, these are all Tree of Heaven shrubs. They're probably all suckering from one tree. They put out over they have male and female trees, and the female trees can put out over 300,000 seeds a year. They're very quick growers. They can grow up to 10 feet a year. And like I said, they're the primary host for spotted lanternfly. Because they are a sucker tree, it is a little bit harder to manage them. So there's a couple of different options here for management. So foliar spray, hack and squirt, and basil bark are all options. Some of the lookalikes, so we have sumacs. You're going to have this terminal leaf, and all of their leaves will have toothed edges. For Tree of Heaven, some of the big distinctions, first off, is that it smells really bad if you break a leaf open. It smells like rotten peanut butter. I didn't think peanut butter could go rotten, but then I smelled a leaf and I realized that it could go rotten. And you're going to look for, there's these tiny little notches at the leaflet base. You can see them on all of the plants or all the leaves on the stalk. And the terminal leaf is actually going to look a little bit different. It's got one leaflet. As you can see, these ones are kind of almost melded together. And it's got smooth edges, so it's not going to have those toothed edges like sumac. Black walnut is another one that it can look similar to. You're not going to have those notches, and it is toothed again, and it also will not have a terminal leaflet. So we covered foliar with the buckthorns. So skipping over how to do a foliar spray, it would be the same thing. You can use a triclopyr or glyphosate. Hack and squirt are what is mostly recommended for tree of heaven. And so you can see here, this is what a hack and squirt looks like. You're going to take an axe or a hatchet, put it in at a 45-degree angle. You're breaking into that cambium layer. Again, that's the same layer that you would use in a cut stump treatment that's alive. You want to try and use the bark or leave the bark on the tree. It acts as a little cup for your herbicide. And it does, again, it's pretty low risk for drifting off target because you're just right there in that cut. It's a little bit of a stronger mix, usually 50 to 75% active ingredient for using a hack and squirt. Again, you can use those triclopyrs and glyphosates. You can also use an imazapyr. Keep in mind it can have some off-target effects as well. The best time to treat tree of heaven is from about July to color change. Basil bark spray is another option. These ones, though, really only work for about about trees that are 6 inches in diameter at breast height or less. You're going to start about 12 to 18 inches above ground level, and you're going to spray downwards around the entire circumference of the tree, and then that herbicide is getting absorbed into the tree, kind of like a cut stump would be, except for suckering trees like tree of heaven, cut stumps can actually trigger suckering. It can really set them off, and so then you just have a forest of small tree of heavens growing around where you just did your cut stump. When you're doing a basil bark spray, you're going to want to use an ester formulation of a triclopyr paired with a forestry oil, kind of like what we talked about with the cut stump in the wintertime. For replacing tree of heaven, it may be best to wait a season or two before you start doing it to deal with all of the suckering that's going to happen when you treat it. Hack and squirts and basil bark can reduce suckering, but it's not going to eliminate it. So you're going to want to give it a couple of seasons just so that whatever you plant doesn't just get immediately crowded out by the tree of heaven suckers. Usually you want to replace it with a fast-growing species. So sumacs are great. Staghorn sumacs spread through their root system. They have a beautiful fall color. They put out berries that the birds and you can eat. Sumac is often used. I've heard sumac lemonade. You can have sumac spices. So I think sumacs are an underappreciated species. Black walnuts are basically the slower growing nut producing version of tree of heaven. They can be toxic to some other plants, so it may be best to be strategic about where you're putting them. I forgot to hit the next. This is black walnut here. It is what's called allelopathic, so it's putting chemicals into the soil that help black walnut grow, and maybe not so many other species. But they're a great species for wildlife as well. And then I threw pawpaw in there because I am partial to pawpaws. And so it's a new species that is starting to get moved around a bit more as our climate is changing. They spread clonally, so they will form thickets. They can tolerate shade and sun, and they do have an edible fruit as well. And so that might be another option for something. Poplars also are a great option. They will take over an area, and they also spread clonally as well. Onto our last species, invasive honeysuckles. These are also native to Eurasia. They were introduced again as an ornamental. They are actually a deep shade plant. So you can see them here. They leaf out before the trees do. And then when it gets shady, they're still thriving. They displace their natives, especially you can see here, there's no tree saplings that are going to be able to compete with that. They are an excessive cedar. They can reduce birds or cover for birds during nesting season as well. So, it's not creating a very healthy forest ecosystem. For control, we're going to skip over a lot of the slides for control because it's all the ones we've covered already. Mechanical is great. We have a lot of people who use the weed wrenches on honeysuckles, foliar spray for those smaller shrubs, and then cut stump for those bigger shrubs. So we have multiple species of invasive honeysuckles, including one that is actually a mix. So the Bell's is actually a hybrid of Marl's and Tartarian. So when you're looking at the leaves, Amira is the easiest because it comes to this really sharp point. It's got this little weird curve going on, and that is distinctive to them. The Tartarian leaves are going to be smooth and hairless. They're a little bit smaller than everybody else. The Marrow's is going to be downy. It's going to feel soft, almost fluffy. And then the Bell's is going to be either downy or hairless. But then you can look for these flowers as well. They're going to have different colors. The pink and white is usually a sign that it's going to be Bell's, which is that hybrid. And then there is one vining species, the Japanese honeysuckle. That's what this is. So if you see something vining with those really white flowers, that's probably Japanese honeysuckle. But we also have native honeysuckles, just to confuse it a little bit more. All of our invasive honeysuckles are actually going to have this hollow pith, which is the middle of a stem. You can see here, it's just a little bit, if you get a clean cut on it, you can usually see it. The native honeysuckles will not have that. They have a completely closed stem. So that is the easiest way. You can tell that any time of year. The berries of native honeysuckles are also only found at the ends of the branches. They have these little weird cupped flowers that they do, or cupped leaves that they do, and then the berries will be at the end of that. Again, this picture from earlier, all along the stems. So when we're replacing honeysuckles, the easiest thing for Japanese honeysuckle is to turn it into trumpet honeysuckle, which is a native species. I do also want to specify that trumpet honeysuckle is different than trumpet vine, which is also an aggressive vining species. But trumpet honeysuckle is a really big attraction for hummingbirds as well. You can see with those brilliant red flowers and the tube-like flowers. So easiest thing for Japanese honeysuckle is just turn it into trumpet honeysuckle. For shrubs that will tolerate some of that shade, we've got downy serviceberry. That's going to be a really brilliant white flower that comes out at the beginning of the season. It can also tolerate sun and multiple soil types. This is gray dogwood. It is also can be a little bit more of an aggressive grower. It's a little bit more, it can grow pretty much anywhere. As you can see, tolerates a range of moisture, soil, and sunlight conditions. And it puts out really pretty white flowers, and it will put out that dogwood berry that birds will eat. And then again, we've got American elderberry. It's going to prefer a little bit of sun, so closer to the tree line is probably what you're looking for, but it is going to be looking for those moist soils as well. So when it comes to invasive species, what is something that everyone can do? And that is it's decontamination. It can remove up to 88% of attached seeds. It doesn't take that much time. You don't have to have a master's degree for it. You just have to, especially for your boots, boot brush before and after you're on a trail is the best practice. But if you can boot brush at least before or at least after, that's the best thing that you can do. You can see down here, these are mobile boot brushes that we give out to a lot of people and in-person presentations. And if you're like, wow, that looks like a horse hoof pick, it's because it is. But this is the same material as you can see in here. And when you have a lot of mud in your tread, this pick is really good for getting that out. If you're out with your car, especially if you're off-roading or something and you see plant material in your car, just make sure that you pull it out. And then cleaning off any heavy machinery that you're using, tractors or anything like that if you're doing invasive species treatments. And then some of the easiest places to find invasive species, these are places in the car. Again, that, like we just saw, the wheel wells can grab onto things as you're driving through. Your floor mats, just take those out every once in a while and, wash them off on cement or something. Try and make sure that you're not just leaving seeds in your car to pick up to take to another spot. Some resources for you. Like I said, every county in Michigan is covered by a SISMA. You can see here, you can look it up and you can find yourself there. Don't pay attention to this email. It's an old email for me. My email is at the end of the slide or at the end of the presentation. And there's also the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, which is a community science program run by the Michigan State University Extension. You can report invasive species through there, and when you report them, wherever they're reported, wherever in Michigan they're reported, they will send a report to the SISMA coordinator for that SISMA. So when somebody records something in my CERT 4 counties, I get a report for that. And then if it's our early detection species or high priority species, we can go and check it out and see about doing management for that area. They also have really good species information. So you can find on there anything in the Midwest that's even maybe just starting in the Midwest. And that does include aquatic invasive species, terrestrial invasive species, some insect pests, and some mammals as well. They're really great. So if you're ever curious about information or about invasive species, you can look on there to learn more about them, including where there have been reports for them. And then some of our other resources, we've got our website, habitatmatters.org. You can find a lot of our information on there, including our top 12. We have a really great pamphlet that a lot of people love to use called Plan Before You Plant. That's on our other resources. That will tell you a lot of common ornamental invasive species and what you can plant instead. That link to the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, MISIN, is on there as well. MichiganInvasives.org is going to have that map of all those SISMAs. The Midwest Invasive Plant Network is going to have some of those ornamental invasive sheets that you can check. The Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes, WIGGLE, which is the best acronym ever, they also have something similar to our Plan Before You Plant, but specializing in woody invasives, including vines, shrubs, and trees. And they will also include some information in there that is, or some replacements in there that are non-native, not specifically just native species like our Plan Before You Plant. And the Michigan State Extension puts out such great information. A lot of other universities and their extensions will also put out great information. We learned most of our information about treating Tree of Heaven from the Penn State extension. So if you're not in Michigan, but you still want this information, definitely check out your university extensions. And then this is my contact information, the correct contact information. So if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that, you can always feel free to reach out and get a hold of us. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we will answer some questions.
All right. The first question is in regards to knotweed injections. The question is, wouldn't you want to inject the herbicide in the plant tissue rather than the hollow of the stalk so that the herbicide gets transported down to the rhizome?
Right. So when you're doing that that injection and you have the empty or the hollow stem, it is actually getting down into the root system. You don't have to get it into the plant tissue. It just goes straight down into the root system and it gets absorbed by the plant that way. It's kind of like a foliar spray for the inside of the plant.
Great. And then the next one is just a comment on their understanding is that with knotweed, it's to spray it in the fall when the plant is sending its energy downward.
That is it's a very common part for invasive species where people say to do it in the fall when it's getting ready to go into hibernation. It's not necessarily the only time you can treat. We treat sometimes in the fall just because that's when we can do our aquatic treatments. So that Clearcast and Aquaneat mix has to be 90 days before the first frost. The straight glyphosate, the 9% glyphosate solution, has to be when the flowers are out. But you can treat it any time of year, especially with knotweeds. If you can hit it twice in a year, that's great. So we will oftentimes do treatments in June, and then we'll do treatments again in August to hit anything that we either couldn't get to or that popped up since our last treatment. So treating in the fall is great, but especially with knotweed, you want to make sure that you're giving yourself time because once the first hard frost hits, that plant is dead. They cannot tolerate cold temperatures like that. So as long as you're making sure you give yourself time, and if you've got a big population, especially doing 2 treatments a year is great.
Awesome. Well, that wraps up the questions we have so far. If anybody has anything else, be sure to put it in the Q&A box. Otherwise,
yeah. And if you guys think of anything else too, again, you have my email and also Luke's email. You can either email either of us and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you think of afterwards. And then we will hopefully get this presentation put up on our YouTube page, which you can find at Invasive Species Network. And we'll also have it up on our website as well. So if you want to, if there's anything that you need to look at again or hear again, feel free to go back. That'll probably give us, till next week to get that up there. And then we'll be sending out all of those links again in an email for you. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.